Hey guys, it's SharpZ, and welcome to Genre in a Bottle, the series where I cover video game genres in depth. Since this month is October, the same month where everyone is legally required to cover the spooky, the scary,
Hey, what's up?
What are you doing here?
Well, you sang the song of my people.
This is why I need to change my locks.
Your door was unlocked.
Oh. Can you get out of my room, please?
Fine, last time I offered you any help.
Now, with that out of the way, let's start by asking, what is horror as a genre? Horror is unique as a genre, since it is almost entirely based upon eliciting emotion out of the viewer. Horror books, movies, shows, art, and yes, video games all have the explicit goal of creating a feeling of fear or discomfort in those engaging with them. Whether it be the works of Junji Ito, The Shining, or the one Netflix series that nobody shuts up about, horror relies on the viewer being engaged and immersed to truly be effective. With all this being said, let's take a look at the history of horror in the video game medium, while highlighting some games I consider the best in their class, or to be influential throughout the formation of horror games as we see them today. Compared to other genres like platformers, RPGs, and, well, even to some extent, general adventure games, horror kind of took a while to get its foot into gaming. The two games that people often will regard as the origins of the genre are 3D Monster Maze and Haunted House on the Atari 2600. Oh, so that's how the Pac-Man ghost died. Granted, you can't really do much with the Atari 2600. The first horror game that I think many would consider to be a truly good attempt at horror was Sweet Home on the Nintendo Famicom. Sweet Home, released in 1989, was an RPG based on the movie by the same name. Now, granted, I'm not going to go into too much depth about this game, mainly because, well, if you want to play it, I don't want to spoil too much for you. And honestly, it's suited for its own video. There's more than enough content on it, so maybe some other year, or maybe even later this year if I get around to it. This game, as a horror game, uses the usual mechanics of RPGs and twists them to mess with the player. It's easy to lose party members, health and other resources are scarce, and there's this suspicious and creeping feeling that at any moment you could lose a valuable teammate via death, capture, or other methods. It really looms over the entire playtime and gives you that feeling of, hey, I'm never truly safe in this mansion. Three years after Sweet Home, two more horror games were released, both of which would give a glimpse into the future of horror as a genre. Dark Seed was a point-and-click adventure game focusing more of a psychological and unnerving horror. The player character needs to stop the resurrection of an ancient god, witnessing a lot of, oh god, what is that thing? Anyway, if there was one concern I had with that game, it would be
there's a lot of time linked and specific actions required to actually beat the thing, and with that walkthrough, it's almost like I'm really going to force players to play through it again, and again, and an endless cycle where nothing seems to change, and...
You know what? Let's just look at the other one. Alone in the Dark. If Sweet Home scratched the surface of the survival horror genre, Alone in the Dark jumped into the pool. Alone in the Dark requires the player to avoid monsters, solve puzzles, and, well, survive. A lot of what we see in this game will kind of be relevant later in the video, so while I'm not going to go too in-depth, I do want to briefly mention there is a remake of this game coming out on PS5, so if you want to play it, I would either recommend number one, picking it up on GOG, where all the games in the original Alone in the Dark trilogy are currently available, or number two, pick up the remake, because it honestly looks like it could be decent. But after this, we did have a few games that kind of followed in the steps of Darkseid. Some of the more prominent examples would be Clock Tower, Harvester, and to some extent the full-motion video game Phasmophoria. And I have no mouth and I must scream, but I'm an idiot and forgot that one, so let's move on. However, in 1996, the genre would change forever with the success of one particular game.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Resident Evil.
That's right. Resident Evil. The game that popularized the survival horror genre, and in a way, horror as a whole. Starting life as a remake of Sweet Home, it's all coming full circle. Resident Evil became very much its own thing. Despite this, elements that we've seen as far back as Sweet Home can actually still be seen in this game. Limited inventory, limited resource management, and in a way even the party system, since, well, you have multiple characters in here, and even though you only control one directly, your actions do determine who lives and who dies. Now, I would go in depth about the series of Resident Evil, but since then we've had so many games that it's kind of just gotten ridiculous. Let me see here, we have the sequel. Well, actually, this is the remake of the sequel, Resident Evil 7. Which came out fairly recent. Actually, wait, that was over 5 years ago at this point. Oh man, I'm getting old. The one that I refuse to talk about. The other one that I refuse to talk about. The remake of the first one, which is probably my favorite game if I'm being honest, and the one that everyone loves but I own on the Wii because you know what? It's my collection, I'll do what I want. And that's not even half of them. That's just the ones that I own. Due to the success of Resident Evil, a few other studios and even Capcom themselves decided to try to replicate that success. Games like Dino Crisis immediately come to mind, actually made by the same creator as Resident Evil, and the answer to the question, what happens when life finds a way a little too well? Aside from that, we also have games like Nightmare Creatures. This particular one, which I own but have no idea how it is because I have not actually played it, and, well, Onimusha is another one. Parasite Eve was made by the same creators of Final Fantasy, Square Enix. But there's only one franchise from this era that I would argue rose to a level where it could compete with Resident Evil. Silent Hill. Whereas Resident Evil was mainly a survival horror franchise, Silent Hill is considered by many to be the definitive psychological horror franchise. Silent Hill 1 focuses on Harry Mason as he crashes his car in the town of Silent Hill and is forced to find his daughter. Unbeknownst to Harry, the cult that calls Silent Hill home has plans for his daughter involving an ancient ritual and the resurrection of some god. But honestly, the horror in this game is a good mix of body horror and, well, the people around you. While the actions of the monsters are scary, sometimes it's the actions of those who we view as human to be even more terrifying, especially within the town of Silent Hill. But in my opinion, the franchise didn't truly become psychological horror as we know it until Silent Hill 2 on the PlayStation 2. Silent Hill 2. The one I'm holding here is actually the Xbox version, Silent Hill 2 Restless Dreams, which also got a re-release on the PlayStation 2 as the Greatest Hits version. which I don't think is the most important thing, but I just kind of found interesting. This is also similar to the version that you will see on Windows, so if you manage to find a copy of it, I would highly recommend picking it up. Since I really love this game and I don't want to be the one to spoil it for someone else, I'm going to try to briefly give you a synopsis of what you need to know before going in, and then I'm also going to briefly cover why I think the game works. Beyond that, I will say, if you want to play this, there is one version I will highly recommend you avoid, and that is the HD collection. I know that you've probably heard a million people say that if you have heard any of the discourse around this game, but it's awful. Everyone looks at the Comic Sans sign, but it's worse than that somehow. That is one of the very few things in the game where I'm like, at least I find entertainment in this. In Silent Hill 2, we follow James Sunderland, a man whose wife died 3 years ago, and yet, when he receives a letter from her, telling her that she will meet him at his special place in Silent Hill, he follows it without question. This leads into what I would consider not just one of the best horror games of all time, but one of the best games of all time. Silent Hill 2, simply put, uses every single thing that makes video games unique as a medium, and makes you feel like James Sunderland. Is the game always fun? No. Is the game perfect? Far from it. At times, the controls can feel a little stiff. There were also times where I was frustrated because something was just tied to a timer rather than my actual agency as a player. But beyond that, this game is amazing. One of the things that I think this game absolutely nails is just the smaller details. How when James is running, since he is not in the physically best shape, you'll see him catch his breath after you begin to stop. Details like the fact that his attacks are unwieldy, and compared to other characters like Leon or Chris from Resident Evil, he doesn't swing with as much finesse or with the calculated precision of a soldier. James is a broken man. Even beyond that, there's this uncanny quality to almost everything in the game. The music, which you have been hearing in the background starting right about now, is created by composer Akira Yamaoka, a name which I probably just butchered, but hey, I just have to mention his name because all the work he does for Silent Hill, not just Silent Hill 2, is amazing. His music is as much Silent Hill as in my opinion, the games or even the visuals. Speaking of the visuals, this game was originally created for the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. While granted the footage you're seeing in the background is from the PC Enhanced Edition port, which is running at a fidelity higher than anything you would see back in those days, it still shows just how well the models and the assets have actually aged, in my opinion. While yes, there are a few things here and there, like the trees and the grass, that kind of stick out like a sore thumb, I would argue that the animations, particularly in the CG cutscenes, have aged phenomenally. All that aside, I do want to go ahead and say that if you want to play this game, this is the way I would probably recommend it, since, well, it's the most accessible. Silent Hill 2, 3, and even 1 have kind of been stuck on old platforms for a while, and Enhanced Edition, if you own the old PC copy or can somehow find it, is probably the most friendly way to play it on a modern device. That is without emulation, but granted, I am not going to open that can of worms because I know I'm covering horror games, but I don't want to engage the horror of the comments section. With all that out of the way, I think that Silent Hill really shows the potential of horror in video games. The cohesion of everything from gameplay to music to just the setting. The fog of Silent Hill is something people often point to, which was originally due to the limitations of hardware on the PS2 and PS1, but has since become kind of the aesthetic of Silent Hill. A misty fog where you can't really explain anything. This game isn't designed to really be understood, in my opinion. It's more so a game that hits at the human experience in a way that is uncomfortable and terrifying. It makes you feel like you empathize with James, even when sometimes you think you shouldn't. In my opinion, Silent Hill 2 is one of those games where it's almost infinitely dissectable. You can look at it, and look at it again, and there almost always feels like there's something new to see. In a way, it's an abyss that you can stare into, and then the abyss stares back. So let's move on before I get into that one a little too deep. Granted, after Silent Hill, I think psychological horror kind of took a little bit of time to try to stretch its wings and figure out where exactly it could go next. Well, when it comes to psychological horror, while there's one person who I would argue kind of was instrumental in bringing it into the more modern era, let's just say that the work of that particular person has not aged well. I'm talking about H.P. Lovecraft. Granted, for those of you who are not familiar with why I'm saying this, just look up the name of his cat and you will immediately see why. With all that being said, there is a game that is actually inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft and released for, of all consoles, the Nintendo GameCube. That's right, family-friendly Nintendo, the same company that brought you Mario, Zelda, and Metroid, also brought you this Eternal Darkness. I just thought that would be funny to point out. Anyway, I love this game. It's a fairly rare one to actually find, at least from what I've seen, but if I were to be completely honest, Eternal Darkness kind of holds a special place in my heart when it comes to horror, because it's one of the very first horror games that I actually played all the way through, so I always love the opportunity to go back and look at it again. Alright, so I was going to actually put gameplay footage here, but I kind of ran into a small issue. My GameCube capture card did not want to work for some reason, and on top of that, I could not get the game to run in Dolphin and be recorded by my recording software very well. So, you know what, we're just going to kind of wing it, and I am going to use really weird PNG images and stuff like that to try to get the point across. Eternal Darkness is a game that, as I said earlier, takes a lot of inspiration from the work of H.P. Lovecraft. And, well, the way it uses it is kind of interesting. One thing that I have always hated about the work of H.P. Lovecraft, aside from, well, you know, the racism, is the fact that H.P. Lovecraft stories kind of just end. The idea of he sees the god, he goes mad, and that's it. Eternal Darkness is a game that takes place over the many, many generations of one family, and, well, it kind of works for something like H.P. Lovecraft. Keep in mind that a lot of Lovecraft's work is based on, well, incomprehensible deities that have been around for millions and millions of years, and the idea of there being one family lineage that has to keep dealing with it kind of works. With that being said, the controls of this game are kind of reminiscent of a game like Silent Hill or Resident Evil, fairly tanky and clunky at times, but the thing that I think really makes this game stand out, aside from the magic system, is the sanity system. A system wherein which the more you encounter monsters, the more it kind of begins to slip. And the sanity system begins to break the fourth wall in absolutely crazy ways. It will be like if you were just watching a YouTube video, and in the middle of it, it just cut to something completely different. Eh? Oh, shoot. This again. Give me a second. I'll keep it down here somewhere. Ah, here it is. Well, I didn't mean to make the spooky campfire vibe, but I guess we kind of have to roll with it since the power went out. But before we enter the HD era, we might as well talk about a few more games. Rule of Rose and The Suffering are two games which I think which at least for me immediately come to mind. Both of those games really tried to push what could be shown in the horror medium. Rule of Rose takes place at an orphanage and heavily involves children. Not really going to say more than that. But all I'm going to say is it really shows that kids can be cruel sometimes. And then The Suffering is based off a convict. So, I mean, that kind of just writes itself, doesn't it? Well, I mean, someone still has to write it, but a lot of potential there. Aside from that, one other notable game is Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame is a franchise which is heavily based off of, well, more so a Japanese folklore. The main thing with Fatal Frame is that you use a camera to try to capture ghosts. When this game finally came into the picture...
Was that supposed to be a pun?
No, it wasn't an intentional pun.
Good, because if it was supposed to be a pun, then I have a real bone to pick with you.
Wait, so are you the same guy from earlier, or is this kind of a Scrooge thing where it's going to be 3 different ghosts?
Dude, you think we would all waste our time with you? The afterlife has a pool table. It's actually kind of nice. Oh, while I'm thinking about it, there was something on your door.
A note? Just says cover indie games or else. Well, I mean, I was already planning on that, so might as well hop into it now. I mean, I got an ominous letter on my door. The same year as Resident Evil, one of the first prominent indie horror franchises began. This franchise was Corpse Party, which kind of has a reputation for being a little bit odd. Granted, the thing that I find significant about Corpse Party is its origins. This was a game that was the result of a game jam. And for those of you who are unaware of what that is, a game jam is a competition between indie developers to see who can create the best game in the short amount of time allotted. Usually these games have to follow a specific theme, and for this specific jam, it was made to show the capabilities of the at the time new RPG Maker engine for the Japanese-only PC-98. With all that being said, Corpse Party, while at the time not the biggest success, it actually got number 2 in the competition, was kind of a forerunner of things to come for the scene. You see, some dark age was about to happen when it came to AAA horror games, and games like Corpse Party were ironically about to find a way to unbeat the dead horse. I mean, I get that it's heading into the dark age and all, but it would be nice to finally have my power back on. That would be great. Oh. Well, guess we can work back in the light again. Whew. Well, anyway. The horror industry still had its few staples franchises around this time. Resident Evil was nearing its 4th entry, which, while amazing, and honestly it's still a really great game, inarguably moved away from the horror, more so into the action side, opting for an over-the-shoulder camera instead of the fixed camera angles of the previous games. Granted, that's not to say that this game is bad, but it definitely kind of steered the franchise in a direction that 5 and 6 later embraced. Silent Hill for the Room, which, well, still an amazing game, and honestly one of my favorite games in the series, is kinda divisive to this day among the Silent Hill fanbase. It was the last entry created by Team Silent, so it still has that same DNA as the other 3 original games, but Silent Hill 4 didn't sell well, and Konami being Konami took Team Silent out back and executed them like they were Pyramid Head. So, moving into the HD era, 2 of horror's most prominent franchises were kind of dead in the water. That doesn't mean we didn't get any good horror games in that era. Some that immediately come to mind are The Evil Within, which was actually created by some of the same minds behind Resident Evil, Dead Space 2, a game which took what Resident Evil 4 did and went way more into the horror direction. Dead Space 1 is also amazing, it's just that I don't actually own a physical copy of that one. And one of my personal favorites, Allan Wake, a game which honestly needs to get more attention. This one's fun. The idea of a writer just going to a small mountain town and trying to face some of his inner demons. This game's just like Silent Hill, isn't it? That's why I love it. It's psychological. That's why I love it, isn't it? But, with all that being said, games like Resident Evil 6 kind of killed the genre for a lot of people. But when the AAA companies fail us, that's when indie companies came to save the day. The mid to late 2000s saw the release of a lot of indie horror games. Following in the steps of games like Corpse Party, we have some RPG Maker titles like The Witch's House, which is one of my favorite games. The whole concept of which is curiosity killed the cat. You have to examine stuff to escape, but examining stuff is also what kills you, so be careful and have fun with that. Mad Father, a game which I kind of lump into the same category as games like Rule of Rose, where it's, wait, they can put that into a video game now? Well, I guess that's just great. I am going to say goodbye to my sleep and probably my stomach. And one that also immediately jumps out at me is Yume Nikki. Yume Nikki is interesting in that I can't really explain it, you just have to play it. It is free on Steam, so yeah, have fun with that. Go get it, it's free. I'm not going to stop you. The only person who could stop you is yourself. Or maybe if there's parental controls. Which, if there's parental controls and you somehow got to this video, congratulations, I guess. And, hey, this person's mom who's sitting in the background, they're watching a video that is probably too old for them. You're doing a great job at parenting. Great job. This is very educational content. Well, I would argue that all the games I just mentioned are still fairly important to the history of horror. One game that came out around this time that I would argue is probably most important is Amnesia. Because Amnesia, well, it kind of blew up on a particular website. One which you are probably aware of because this video was on it. That's right, YouTube. And I know that some people are going to get upset about me talking about this, but with horror, it kind of makes sense. You see, horror is a very reactionary genre. As I've mentioned multiple times in this video, for horror to truly be effective, it needs to elicit a reaction out of the person experiencing it. Whether it be psychological horror like Silent Hill, which elicits a feeling of discomfort, or a feeling of disgust at times. Or something like Resident Evil, where it elicits kind of more so a feeling of, I'm in an alien place I don't really belong in. Or a feeling of, oh Lord, I'm running out of resources. Please, I need to save. Where are the ink ribbons? I'm still not over that trauma, am I? But with all that being said, it kind of makes sense that horror would be the one genre that would kind of really benefit from YouTube. You see, when it comes to horror, it's not just fun to react yourself, sometimes it's more fun to watch other people react. And especially for people who might not be the best with scary content, it sometimes helps to see someone else's face getting scared. So, games like Amnesia, while I would argue still a very good game, even with Let's Players kind of being prominent in its rise, actually foreshadows something to come. We're going to have to talk about the giant animatronic bear in the room, aren't we? Darn it, Matt Pat. Whereas Amnesia simply courted the Let's Player scene, FNAF said, you know what, let's take the entire Let's Play scene to Chuck E. Cheese's. It's their birthday, and they're going to enjoy sitting in this office whether they like it or not. Five Nights at Freddy's is a point-and-click adventure game, and I use the term adventure very lightly here. It's more like a point-and-click job shift simulator, except for instead of the animatronics just being boring things that sit over in the corner, they try to kill you. With all of my joking aside, I will say that I think the FNAF games do have pretty good atmosphere at times, and can, in very rare circumstances, scare me. However, they rely way too much on jump scares, which is kind of an issue for a very specific reason. You see, a jump scare is psychological. It's not traditional horror. The best way I can explain this is with salad. I swear this is going somewhere. So, a jump scare. That's your McDonald's salad. It's cheap, it's easy, and I mean, it doesn't taste the best, but it's pretty good for a while, and after you eat it once or twice, you kind of get tired of it. Whereas a scare in a well-crafted scare in a horror game is like a salad that your friend has made from scratch. It's amazing. They took the lettuce, they took the tomato, they took the mushroom, they took... I don't know what you people have on salads. What do I look like? A salad psychic? They took all that stuff and they made this amazing salad. The taste is exquisite and it sticks with you. That is how a good scare works. All the elements are put together and they all build up to one amazing moment. Or multiple moments. Maybe a tomato that you put in one salad is going to be a tomato that also works with another. The salad analogy is no longer working, so I'll drop it. Look, what I'm saying is, good horror has to work beyond just a primal psychological level. Granted, there are some ways that you can still engage that primal horror, yes. Things like the fear of animals, the fear of falling, and fear of the unknown are kind of primal fears in a way, but I would say that solely relying on jump scares is not a good idea. Hot take, I know. They can be done well, and they can be effective if done in a very particular manner. And granted, I would argue that the imagery almost doesn't matter as much as the build-up if it comes to something like a jump. Honestly, I think that fake-out jump scares are sometimes even more scary than their usual ones. If I had a nickel for every time I thought I was going to be jump scared and it ended up just being a floorboard falling and I thought that was scarier than any jump scare they actually used on me, I'll probably have 3 nickels, but, I mean, that's just kind of proving my point. Like, I'm more scared when you have that build-up and nothing happens, because then I think he's just waiting for me to be off guard so he can do something. With my weird rant about jump scares out of the way, I think that we need to talk about the other thing that FNAF kind of established. While Let's Players were definitely a factor in games before, FNAF was one of the first that kind of started, let's just say, lore speculation. Channels like Game Theory are kind of the ones that people always point to, but let's be honest, there's a lot more than that. Channels that like to content farm off of any game with supposedly vague lore or try to read stuff in that's not there. And granted, I would argue that some games kind of tried to fit in this niche. You had games like Hello Neighbor, you had games like Bendy and the Ink Machine, both of which... Bendy and the Ink Machine I would consider actually to be a fairly decent game at times. Granted, there are 1 or 2 issues I do have with it overall. And Hello Neighbor, which the alpha had so much potential, but now whenever I see the game, I just want to go tell it to sit in the corner. Granted, there's more than that, and I would argue that the one that I find the most egregious is Poppy's Playtime, which locks lore behind NFTs. Yeah, I wish I was joking, but I think it's just become too big an issue at this point. However, I do think that there is a correct way to do this, and there's actually one game that I would argue does this better than almost any other example in the genre. Doki Doki Literature Club. I'm being completely serious. This is the one that I think did it right. And honestly, considering all the other weird stuff that I have that is for the demographic that would fit directly for this style of game, it makes sense. I don't know if I can show that. Let me start by talking about what I absolutely think this game does right in the context of games that have very obscure lore. For one thing, all the lore is actually in the game. And I mean that literally. Like, you go into the files and some of it's there. Number two, there's a self-contained narrative within the game. There is a defined beginning, start, and end, and you don't need to really delve into the lore to understand everything. Number three, well, this game's a visual novel, a genre which is kind of notorious for saying what gameplay, and yet somehow it still uses mechanics like the save system and pretty much everything else to, well, make you have a feeling of supreme unease. The Plus version, which is the version that I was holding earlier, actually also has an interface that's added above everything, and I will say if I have one critique of that version, it's that they should have used that interface for more scares. There's one or two that they do, but honestly, they could have done more, and I'm kind of disappointed in that. But, yeah. With that being said, I think that about covers almost everything that we want to do, so let's just do a real quick wrap-up, and then we'll get into the actual fun part for me, the analysis. I know I've been fairly negative at points in this video, but honestly, I'm feeling kind of excited for the future of horror. Resident Evil 7 came out longer ago than I thought it would, and brought Resident Evil back. Not to mention PT, which, while it's sad that game died, that game inspired a lot of other smaller games. For those unaware, PT was a teaser for a potential Silent Hill game, which Konami also took out back and executed. Because Konami does not want to see me happy, they just want to see my wallet. They should change that to their slogan. We don't want to see you happy, we just want to see your wallet. Konami, you can pay me for that. Oh, who am I kidding? They didn't even pay Hideo Kojima for anything he did. They're not going to pay some random YouTuber. Anyway, even aside from that, a few other franchises have been coming back. As I mentioned before, we have seen the return of Alone in the Dark with a remake. There are rumors actually going around that the team behind games like Layers of Fear and The Observer, Bloober Team, is going to be working on a remake of Silent Hill 2, which I have mixed feelings about. That will probably get its own video. And even though there's been some rough patches along the way, the Alone in the Dark reboot on the Wii immediately comes to mind, which was a failure because you are neither alone nor in the dark at times, so why call it Alone in the Dark? And some of the Fatal Frame games have kind of been dipping, at least from what I've heard. I haven't played them, but at least from fans of the games, that's what I've kind of been hearing. But honestly, I feel like all that would really make me happy would be seeing some re-releases here and there. Maybe games like Dino Crisis would be great to have on new platforms. Silent Hill HD Collection was an interesting concept that I think could get revisited and done well without the science and comics sans. I'm still not over that. Maybe I should talk to my therapist about it. Dr. Kaufman, and that is why I really need to stop playing those games. Anyway, let's get into the design section. Because while I really did like playing all these games for this retrospective, that's actually kind of the meat and potatoes of what the series is. Since I kind of briefly touched on it before, what I want Genre in a Bottle to be is an analysis of the history of the genre, and then an analysis of what I think makes a game in that genre good. With that being said, there is one question that I was constantly asking myself. what does a horror game need to do to scare? And that's when I went to my natural tendency. If there's one thing that I love more than anything else, it is cheesy acronyms. So, I present to you Scare. Alright, so I know that from what I've said, you're probably feeling like spoilers are about to come up and this might be the point that you want to leave. So I thought before we get into the whole analysis, which is my favorite part of this video, we should probably go ahead and get some recommendations out. So when it comes to what is kind of obvious, I would recommend Silent Hill 2. I would say if you're going to try to find this, either A, find it cheaply because this game is fairly expensive. The price is fairly up there. Granted, Xbox price is not that bad. I want to say I got mine for about $40 or so, and it's backwards compatible with the 360. So if you do own a 360, this will work on it. Aside from that, Doki Doki Literature Club. The original is free, and it's still on Steam and a few other platforms. As for Resident Evil, I would say that there are quite a few good starting points that you can look into. So, starting from the newest games and going back. Resident Evil 2 Remake. This is a remake of Resident Evil 2. You don't really need to play 1 to understand 2, even though both of them take place in the same universe and there's some connection. They are both kind of isolated events, if that makes any sense. Like, 1 does have some effect on the story of 2, but it's not to the extent where you're going to play this game and think, oh, I don't understand what's going on. And it doesn't really spoil Resident Evil 1 either. So, Resident Evil 7 is the first entry in, I guess, the new style of Resident Evil that they started with this game. First-person camera, going into a... If I remember correctly, the house is in Louisiana. There's a cannibalistic family and a whole bunch of weird stuff that happens. I don't know. I just know that I like this game, and it's not too connected to the other games. There is one specific character who I think shows up, but that's about it, if I remember correctly. Resident Evil 4. There's a little more story behind this one, but many regard this one as the best Resident Evil game. In my opinion, I don't like that it kind of moved away from the horror side, more so to the action. But I will still say it's a pretty good game. If you find yourself really liking action games and are kind of averse to the more, I guess, tanky controls of some older horror games, this one kind of provides a decent middle ground. I have the Wii version here, which I would say is my preferred way to play. I just like motion control aiming. I don't know why. I'm trying to quit. And Resident Evil Remake was released on GameCube, and now it's on pretty much everything, which actually kind of applies for all the Resident Evil games I just mentioned. They're even coming to Switch. Granted, 4 is already on Switch, but 2 and 7 remakes. Well, excuse me, 2 remake and 7. Ugh, I am completely discombobulated. Are coming to Switch. Actually, interestingly enough, 7 Cloud version has been on Switch for the past... I want to say it's been 3 or 4 years, because it's been on the Japanese eShop almost since Switch launched. And then with all that aside, if we're talking like games like Resident Evil, Onimusha was pretty good. That one kind of has more of a, I guess, feudal Japan, excuse me. There's going to be one Japanese resident who has studied Japanese history way more than I am and is laughing at me right now. And you have my full permission to do that. Keep laughing at me. If you can actually find some entertainment out of this video, that would be great. Dead Space, as a series, I actually picked this up today. I know I said I didn't have a physical copy, and it was actually true when I recorded that earlier section, but now it's not. And yeah, it's a good series. It kind of takes what Resident Evil 4 did, leans more into that horror angle. Allan Wake. This one's not really as much into that horror category. I would say it's kind of Silent Hill light. It has more so it's more so a thriller than a horror game most of the time. But I would say if you kind of need that gateway game, this would be one of the good ones to go for. Beyond that, we do have a few that I actually don't own physically, but I think also are worth mentioning. So Omori, right off the bat, that one, it kind of gives me the same vibes as Earthbound, at least when I started playing it, and I'm just going to say it's an amazing horror RPG. I don't really want to spoil anything because it's just that good. You need to play it. If there is any one game where I can say, hey, look, I don't care who you are, whether you like RPGs or not, go play it and you'll probably enjoy it, it's Omori. Detention. That was a game made by Red Candle, a studio from Taiwan, which unfortunately got into some trouble with the CCP and had one of their games removed from a lot of online stores. Granted, I think Detention's one of the more interesting horror games on this list. It takes a lot from Taiwanese culture, and honestly, I really like it. It feels really unique. It takes historical aspects of things from their country and kind of recontextualizes it with their folklore to make something that I think really engaged me from beginning to end. Let's see here. World of Horror. That one is actually not released yet, but it's a roguelite RPG with art inspired by Junji Ito and I guess a general lore kind of inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. And oh boy, it has this beautiful 1-bit art style, which is black on white, and it looks astounding. It looks beautiful. I can't recommend that one enough. Moving on, before I completely go into a rant on how much I am looking forward to the release of that game, we have the Bad Dream series. This one I wouldn't say falls as much into the, oh, it's absolutely horrifying camp as the, I just really, really like these games. They have this unique aesthetic where it's kind of pen, ink on parchment, and it looks amazing for a point and click. Like, if you're making a point and click, I would say take notes, because this is a unique art style. I would rather have a game with a unique art style that's memorable than another point and click where it has a very cartoony art style yet again. I'm not saying anything against those style of point and clicks. I think if you do it well, I do like it. But man, that game just surprised me. Speaking of games that surprised me, The Forest. It's an open world horror game. Not something I thought I would actually be saying. It has multiplayer, but I would recommend actually not playing that way because it kind of dampens the horror. But you know what? Do what you want. A particular shout out here just for the AI on the enemies. It's surprising how human they feel at times. It's especially since they know how to use stealth very, very well. So you have to spend a whole lot of time before you can even consider starting a fight with them. Since we're still talking about games that kind of come from that, since we just started talking about a game that's 3D and kind of higher end when it comes to graphics, Bloober Team is a studio which has made quite a few good horror games. The two I would immediately recommend are The Observer and Layers of Fear 2. I love Layers of Fear 1 as well, but Layers of Fear 1 and 2 are not very connected. And honestly, I would say that 2 messed with me a little more than 1 did, because I feel like 1 takes place in a mansion, which is kind of a played-out scenario. 2 takes place over quite a few places, but the settings like a ship are much more terrifying to me, because you can't just escape that. Like a mansion, even if the door's locked, I mean, you could get an axe and chop that out, but you're on a ship, you're in the middle of the ocean, where are you going to go? The Observer is a cyberpunk horror, which is kind of an interesting concept. You play as a detective who has to solve a few murder cases, and things kind of spiral downhill from there. Honestly, that one's an easy recommendation, and if you were to ask me what my favorite work Bloober Team has done is, it's probably The Observer. Before we go, I do have one more I want to recommend, but this one's entirely shilling. So, Bane, Family of Misfortunes is my own horror game. That one is getting its final patch at the end of this month, and it would mean a lot to me if you went ahead and downloaded it. The game is completely free. It's on Game Jolt and Itch, at least it's on Game Jolt and Itch, but the Mac version's only on Game Jolt due to Itch's file size standards. I can't upload the Mac version onto there. But if I had to give a basic synopsis to try to gauge if you'd be interested in it or not, number one, it's a top-down horror game inspired by other RPG Maker horror games, which just view me saying these as recommendations for them because they're all really good. Witch's House, a little bit of Yume Nikki inspiration in there, Ib, Mad Father, all those kind of games kind of had a little bit of inspiration on it. The entire concept behind Bane is a woman with amnesia in a strange yet familiar mansion needs to find her memories. I'm not going to even act like this game holds a candle to anything else on the list, but, it would mean a lot to me if you took some time to maybe take a look at it. And if you enjoyed it, you know what? Leave a comment below, or at me on Twitter or Instagram or something. My socials are, I'm pretty sure, linked to my account. So if you like it, just give me some feedback. And if you have issues with it, give me some feedback. I'm not working on that game anymore, but if it's a game-breaking bug or something, I'm more than willing to fix it. If you're curious for more details, I actually have trailers on the channel, and my website has full details on the patch notes. So, without further ado, now that we're done with the recommendation section, let's move into the section that I am most excited for, the genre analysis. Alright, for those of you who don't want to even take a chance of spoiling any games that you want to play, but also want to continue onto this section, there will be a scrolling list right now of what chapter covers what games. So if you want to skip to those particular chapters, timestamps will be in the description down below. Now, with all that out of the way, let's finally move into the analysis. Starting with the first letter of the acronym, S. And S stands for dun-dun, suspense. Now, this is probably the most obvious element for any form of horror. You see, just like comedy, which is in a way the inverse of horror, you need to have a build-up for the punchline to be effective. Except instead of a punchline, it is more so a knife gut. At least if you're at Camp Crystal Lake. At least that's what I'm assuming. My terrible sense of humor aside, what makes suspense so essential in horror is, well, the fact that nothing in reality can be scarier than the human mind. You see, we have a tendency to want to make things worse than they actually are, or overthink things, especially when we're in tense situations. Now, usually the old adage goes, show, don't tell. And I feel like there is one particular case study that I want to look at here that I feel exemplifies this to a T by using a whole lot of methods to build up suspense before a really good scare. And that is the first few minutes of Silent Hill. Alright, so, as I see things which are added to this scene to create suspense, I will show them on the right side of the screen. Now, right off the bat, we have the fog, which was actually created due to the PS1's lesser processing power, but has the added side effect of limiting visibility. As such, everything is kind of hidden from view. This even applies to the cutscenes, so it appears that they knew this could be visually effective. Right here, the lack of any interaction with a character who is your daughter is kind of off-putting and a little unnatural. So even though that is probably more so for plot purposes, I'm gonna add it to the list. As you can see here, she disappears from view, despite the fact that she should still be somewhat visible. It's not like I'm moving that much slower than her. And the fact that these buildings are kind of, well, making you feel a little claustrophobic. You feel more caged in. Now, all of that was just a warm-up. We're about to get into the majority of things here in just 1 second. Just stretching my legs a little here before we get into the long stretch. Right around this corner on the fence, it says beware of dog. And the dog we're supposed to beware of is here on the floor dead. What could have done that? One thing also to note here is the camera angles. As you have probably noticed, the camera in this game, despite allowing the player to have some control, in very specific moments will rip it away. In particular of note is the camera angle that you just saw, which if I remember the correct term, is called a Dutch angle. It's an angle where the camera is facing down upwards at the character and can be used effectively, but if it's overused, it can be it can become a telegraph for when a scare is going to happen. Here we also have angles that limit the view of what's ahead of you. And, well, this fence is slightly propped open, so it's a sign someone's been here. Of course, there's the darkness here, which is kind of like the fog in that it's designed to limit visibility. But on top of that, darkness is just kind of a natural psychological fear of many people. Once again, claustrophobic camera angles and the tilting camera, leading into the sound of this wheelchair. Now, this works on a few levels. Number one, it's a misdirect, so you think that might be the sound of what you're actually supposed to be scared of, but it isn't. Number two, there's this bed right here, which is kind of also misdirect, but more so a way to foreshadow what's happening. As you've probably noticed, there's blood on the ground, the camera's beginning to tilt a lot more, and now we're at the point where it's kind of obvious something's going to happen. The music's beginning to swell. If I remember correctly, violins and pianos kind of come into the soundtrack at this point. And the camera begins to snap at points rather than flow, which is something that works fairly effectively if you want to scare a player. That, and then you see these things on the ground and you can't really tell what they are. You go up to see it, and then you see this cutscene. Now, this might seem like what all the build-up was for, and in a way it was, but then there's this. Now, granted, these enemies are fairly easy to beat after you have weapons, but you don't have anything to defend yourself at this point, so with how tough as nails some old horror games can be, your immediate fear is, well, I'm gonna die. And I'll just let the rest of the game carry it from here, so yeah. Now, I know that was a whole lot, but let's kind of take a step back and digest it. Now, if you were paying attention, you probably noticed there are two different kinds of methods used to scare the player. I usually like to categorize these as a diegetic method and a non-diegetic method. For those of you who are unaware what diegetic means, the best analogy I can use is with music. So, say you're watching a movie. If there's a song that they are listening to, so Guardians of the Galaxy, you often hear Star-Lord with a cassette tape. That music would be considered diegetic. It's music that is taking place within the world itself. However, the orchestrated pieces that you hear behind specific scenes are not diegetic. Those are more so there for the audience. And, well, in video games, I view it as no different. There are some aspects that are of this scare that could be viewed as diegetic. Things that would make the player character uncomfortable as well as the player. The examples that immediately come to mind are the dog and the beware of dog sign, the interactions between Harry and his daughter, and to top it all off, we have the bloody bed and the wheelchair. There's also aspects that wouldn't necessarily apply to Harry, but more so apply to the player. A lot of these aspects are actually applied more so to have the player relate to whoever the protagonist or player avatar is on a more personal level. For example, the turning camera angles, and the way that the camera often directs you down a specific path in Silent Hill 1, is often used to reflect the feelings of claustrophobia, the feelings of not being able to see a whole lot, or the feeling of isolation. Especially in the alleyway, as the cameras begin to turn, it kind of gives off the same feeling that you would feel if you're walking down an alleyway and you can't see around the corner. Some of the camera angles even give off vibes of you are someone who is staring at your own character. The other one is music. Obviously, the music that you hear in the scene is not something that Harry is hearing, but even beyond that, that music helps with that build-up. The music kind of helps you feel more like something's off. We have unfortunately not really reached that level yet, where you can kind of just give the player that feeling that something is slightly off with some kind of mental input. So music is kind of the closest thing we can get in some circumstances. But with all that build-up, the scare is so much more effective. If Silent Hill 1 just started with you standing right in front of the alleyway, walking directly into it, and then boom, dead body, it's not going to be as effective. Granted, that doesn't mean that you can't start a game off with some violent or gory imagery. This clip was taken within the first 5 minutes of playing Silent Hill, so obviously you can do it quickly if you have a good build-up to it. Also, a few games that take place in a more apocalyptic setting, or some setting where you're more expectant of things like blood and gore, might be able to use that effectively. But one of the key aspects in creating suspense is actually our next letter. The letter C, which stands for Granted, I know when I say control, you're immediately thinking one of these. But actually, no. Well, I guess to some extent, maybe. Control, in this term, means more so on the developer side. You see, while with every game there's some aspect of showmanship and illusion to it, after all, I always like to phrase it as there's a whole lot of people working under that stage to make sure that the entire game looks nice, there's kind of more of an essentialness to it in horror games. You see, take for example Resident Evil. With the first 3 games, partially due to the hardware limitations of the PS1, which is, funnily enough, something that's been a recurring theme between Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and I don't know, it'll probably be on my gravestone at this point that I didn't live long enough according to the hardware limitations of the PS1. Anyway, due to those hardware limitations, Capcom decided that instead of making the environments and the characters 3D, they would make the environments 2D images. Now, this has 2 effects. Number 1, the fixed camera angles. The fixed camera angles are kind of a staple of these early survival horror games, in particular Resident Evil. You see, the benefit of a fixed camera angle as opposed to a free range camera is that you can very much control what players can and cannot see. For example, look at this corner. The fact that this is a static image means that I can't look around that corner, I have to go up to it and move around it. Now, moving on from Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, let's briefly talk about Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 used tank controls, limited how you could aim your gun, and, well, there's a few other things that game did to make sure that you couldn't go full action hero. With both of these games, one thing that's actually key to it is the control of resources as well as the control of the camera. You see, resources, while being similar to what I mentioned in the suspense portion, diegetic, actually have a double effect here. You see, one of the best examples I can point to is the ink ribbons. Now, saving is kind of a meta aspect of games that we all just expect. It's something that most people regard as a gimme, but the moment you have to use a resource to save, you begin to think a whole lot more about it. Now, granted, I know some people would argue that you should be able to save whenever and wherever you want, and I would say Well, it depends on the game. However, it is inarguable that the fact that you are limited by saves in specific Resident Evil games infinitely makes them more terrifying. Even if I knew where every single zombie was in the Spencer estate, I would still be terrified if I realized, hey, if I take damage from these 1 or 2 zombies, I only have 2 saves left. So, do I want to save after this boss fight, or do I think I can do it again and survive with more health? And that goes beyond just the saving, obviously. Things like bullets and herbs and other healing supplies are also limited. This is part of why Resident Evil 5 and 6 failed in my opinion, not just due to a lack of limitation when it came to resources, but a lack of limitation when it came to, well, movement. If you look at Resident Evil 6 in particular, the combat system is actually amazing. I'm not going to lie and say that I hate Resident Evil 6's combat system, but for a Resident Evil game, yeah, it doesn't really fit. You see, the fact that you can do almost anything, and I get that these are trained soldiers, but at this point it's kind of ridiculous. I can shoot while crouching, I can make sure to run and slide into this. There's a whole bunch of crazy stuff that you can do in Resident Evil 6, and it kind of dampens the survival horror feeling. Granted, control actually is something that goes beyond Resident Evil and into horror as a whole. I'm just using Resident Evil since it's kind of the easiest example to point to, but let's move into multiplayer horror for a second. Phasmophobia is a game that immediately comes to mind when I think about this. You see, this game has control over your voice chat. Voice chat is kind of a common thing in multiplayer games nowadays. And granted, I am not the best person to ask about multiplayer games, I'm more so a single-player guy myself. The fact that they take the voice chat and manipulate it is kind of interesting. Through the use of gadgets like radios or walkie-talkies, you can talk to each other, but there's filters applied over it. So it's not like you're going to get that crystal clear mic quality all the time. Even beyond that, after you die, the only form of communication you have is lifting up items and messing with your teammates, so yeah, it kind of works. It gives you that feeling of isolation, it makes death have meaning, and it kind of makes communication in its own way a limited resource. A few other games that I think exemplify this fairly well. If you look at something like Dead Space, even though there's some absolutely humorous moments, it kind of pulls from Resident Evil when it comes to limitations. Of course, you have other games which like to kind of do meta breaks, which I think this is how you can make one effective, when it feels like control is taken away from the player by the developer. Eternal Darkness does this a few times, but I kind of want to shut up because talking about meta content kind of ruins it. Now, with the section on control over, the key question I ask is, what if you're supposed to be controlling things, what does that leave for the player? And the next letter actually answers that. Because, well, kids, welcome to Sesame Street. The letter of the day is A. A as in... That's right, agency. Now, granted, I know this is kind of a weird place to go, but this is something that seems to be a little more exclusive to games. You could make the argument that for a movie, you can try not to press the pause button, or for a book, you have to turn the page, but with horror games, you can actually force a different level of interaction. You see, even with games that are considered things like walking sims or visual novels, there is something that you need to do to progress. The two games that I think immediately come to mind for me are Doki Doki Literature Club and Layers of Fear. Let's start with Doki Doki, just since, I've played it more recently, and honestly, I always feel the need to go back to it around Halloween. Doki Doki is different from some of the other games that we have covered today in major ways. For one thing, unlike games like Silent Hill or Resident Evil, it doesn't really have any form of control. You could probably beat this game with a keyboard with just one button on it, but that doesn't mean that the game is requiring you to do nothing. You still have to press the button to beat it, but even beyond that, and if you have not played Doki Doki, this is your last chance to exit because I'm going to be spoiling the big twist of the game in 3, 2, 1. Doki Doki uses meta qualities to actually fill in for the parts that would be lacking due to it being a visual novel. The fact that you have to actually go into the files to complete the game kind of helps with the whole feeling of this game and this entire thing is not how it's supposed to be. There are references in the files to some unknown project. There are a whole lot of things under the surface and endings that you can only get by messing with the files in ways that seem unexpected or unintentional. Heck, the files themselves actually change throughout gameplay. Now, I know that this is kind of a weird point to get on, but when it comes to Doki Doki, since it's a visual novel, it doesn't have the same kind of agency that you could force out of something like Dead Space, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, so it has to rely on other methods. Granted, I'm not saying that you can't make a good horror visual novel with no meta aspects, but Doki Doki uses a lot of meta. Granted, if you want to look more so at stuff that's in the game, there is the save and load system. There is the fact that you have to actually click at certain points to progress, and the fact that the game actually upsets the agency every once in a while to make the scares more effective. However, I think there is one game that I want to mention really quickly, mainly because, well, while Doki Doki is an example that I want to use mainly to justify the fact that there is agency in a game that seems like it doesn't have any, Layers of Fear is a game that I consider to be all about agency. Layers of Fear is a game that many people would label as a walking sim, and yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I can't really deny that to some extent. Granted, I really don't like the term walking sim, because I feel like it's kind of a degrading way to refer to a game, but in Layers of Fear 1 at least, there are no ways to die. There are exactly 0 chances of failure. The only things that will change are your ending, depending on how you interact with the world. Now, with that being said, the fact that you have to interact and progress with the world is kind of the part that makes the horror actually engaging in that game. In this particular circumstance, I actually want to give a shout out to the Switch version's motion controls. And I know some people are going to get upset about that, but let me explain. You see, the fact that I have to actually move my hand to open the door feels a little more immersive, at least to me. And number 2, since these controls are optional, I feel fine mentioning them as a nice option if you're like me and kind of like the idea of, hey, I have to do this work myself. Granted, another game that I also want to mention that I've brought up a few times in here is Dead Space. There's a lot of moments in Dead Space that could very well have been made cutscenes, but they instead decide to make playable. You see, the thing is, when it feels like it's your own actions that are being judged rather than the actions of the character in a cutscene, it immediately becomes more personal. When my character is killed in the cutscene, and it's something where I feel like it was a triggered event, I will probably say to myself, well, they shouldn't have been that stupid. But if I am playing as my character and they get killed, then that's my fault. Granted, a lot of good horror games will also use this agency to force you into situations you don't want to be in. For example, with Layers of Fear again, you have to open the door and progress to go forward. There is no other option. And oftentimes, the scares, or the weird things that are going to happen within the game, are actually triggered by something that you have to do, whether it's opening a drawer, whether it's just general investigation. Granted, there is one game that actually goes into a perfect example for this, involving investigation, and that is The Witch's House. As I mentioned earlier, this game operates under the principle of curiosity killed the cat. While there are a whole lot of deaths, which are to some extent cutscenes, the thing is you have to interact with the world. And usually when you die, it's your fault. Sometimes it's nonsensical, sometimes it's stupid, but that's kind of the horror of it. The fact that every single interaction you make is something you need to do to progress, but yet at the same time it's the very thing that's going to kill you. You see, you need to force the player to progress, otherwise it's no better than a horror movie. I mean, you can always press pause during a horror movie, but the start and the end aren't contingent upon you continually pressing a play button after every single chapter. Now, with agency out of the way, it seems like we have a lot of the gameplay side of it covered. I know what you're saying. Yes, I know I need to build suspense. I need to make sure that I control what the player is and is not seeing so that that suspense can be more effective. And I need to make sure that the player is the one who is forced to make the decisions of confronting the horror, and I'm not constantly pushing them down an escalator into the pits of hell. But how far should I go with all this? Well, in order to make that decision, there's one thing that's required. And granted, while it's required in almost every form of media, horror is the one where if this is not applied, it can have disastrous consequences. Now, let's talk about So, you've got your grotesque imagery, you've got your mechanics, and you've got enough gameplay that you can decide the player's going to interact with the horror in this way. Now, this goes to the more personal level. You've made all this cool stuff and you want to show it, but should you? Restraint is essential in almost any form of game creation, or heck, any form of art creation. While there is kind of this urge to go all out, sometimes that's not the best option. Take, for example, one game that I think does this very well, while also doing it very, very poorly. So, you have your creepy scenes, you have everything else created. Now you just need to do one thing. Know when to use it and be patient with it. Actually, for this one, I'm going to be spoiling a decent amount of a specific game, but it's one that I think shows how to do this very well and not very well at the same time. And that game in question is Corpse Party. Or, for this specific example, Corpse Party Blood Covered. Or as the full title in Japan is Corpse Party Blood Covered Repeated Fear. We're just lucky that this isn't Sachiko's Birthday Bash, because even though I really, really hate myself, I am not going to play that game. At least not now. And if you people beg me, probably still won't. Anyway, let's just roll that clip really quickly, and I can get really deep into this. Now, for the uninitiated, I'm not really going to explain Corpse Party lore too much, because I really don't need to for the sake of this example. But let's start by going to what I think is the most obvious. As the title implies, Corpse Party takes place in a location with a lot, and I mean a lot of corpses. As you currently see, this menu right here actually treats them as a collectible. Now granted, the first few actually caught me off guard, but after that I found myself more so frustrated that I might miss one, since these name tags do provide a decent amount of lore to them. But even beyond that, Corpse Party tends to do bloody, gory, and often nonsensical deaths. Yeah, here's the thing. I think that Corpse Party actually can make this work at times. There are actually a few deaths that caught me off guard, but generally speaking, they are not the deaths that focus as much on blood and guts as the ones that have more so a suspense to them, or the ones that have interesting connotations. Now, with that being said, what do I think this game shows Restraint can do? Well, for that, we need to look at the audio. For the uninitiated, Corpse Party Blood Covered Repeated Fear. Yes, I know how ridiculous that title is, and I know that in the States it was only called Corpse Party 2021. But you know what? This is my video, and the version I own on my Switch is the Japanese version, so deal with it. This game uses binaural audio. Now, granted, many people will know this as the kind of audio that you commonly see in videos for ASMR or similar media. Binaural audio, for a very basic explanation, uses both sides of the audio device. This game recommends that you use headphones when starting it, and honestly, I would recommend that too. Here's the thing. Scenes that are not scary from a visual standpoint are way scarier from a audio standpoint. For example, scenes where things like a chalkboard are being written on, someone is approaching from the distance, or, well, the one I'm about to get into. Once again, heavy spoilers, and I'm going to go ahead and say it. Usually, I know that this thing is a horror video, but things are about to get fairly disturbing, so viewer discretion is highly advised, especially if you're not comfortable with the topic of murder. Now, there is a scene late into the game where you are blindfolded, and the people next to you are being killed. This scene broke me, and while I don't necessarily recommend emulating this scene in a moral sense, I can absolutely say that it understands the purpose of restraint. You see, when I can't see what's going on around me, it makes it a lot more terrifying. After all, as I've said earlier, nothing is more terrifying at times than the human mind. This is part of what the core of psychological horror is, letting the mind of the viewer do the work rather than simply relying on the horror itself. Now, granted, I know that this scene is highly disturbing for reasons more than just the audio. I mean, I'm kind of beating around the bush here, but the thing is, these are children, which kind of gets into the other thing I want to talk about. You see, when I say restraint, I'm also talking about some taboo topics. I would say, in particular, anything that relates to violence against a marginalized group, violence against animals, or violence against children, as well as any crimes of a sexual nature, you need to approach it with the right mindset and attitude. You see, part of it's due to the premise of Corpse Party, but this game tends to murder people non-discriminately. Now, I don't think that you can't make a story like this, but sometimes Corpse Party does not show the tact that a situation deserves, and it almost comes across as comical. And here's the thing, you can do this situation absolutely wrong. Two games that immediately come to mind are, well, The Suicide of Rachel Foster, a game which I wouldn't really consider a horror game, but for the sake of this, I really think I need to mention. This game tries to cover the topic of an affair between a older man and an underage girl, and it flops spectacularly. Even if it was not the intention of the developers, which I am not sure whether it was or not, so if they watch this, I'm just gonna say that with how you portrayed it, it did not land well. And that's a shame because the atmosphere and the actual hotel design itself were fairly well designed, and I would argue the visuals are pretty good too. The one that's more prominent and I think more important to mention here is The Medium, where they touch on similar topics but really don't do it to a good extent. Granted, I think you can do it well. Games like Silent Hill, which I know I've talked a lot about this episode, but seriously, go play those games, touch upon these topics in a manner which I would deem respectful. Oftentimes with Silent Hill, it is not made the focus of the scene, it is merely implied, and even if it is kind of focused on, it's never really used just for the sake of horror. It's used to justify a character. It's used to make things make a little more sense, and it is used sparingly. I can count on one hand the amount of times in this franchise where I've said, you know what? They might have taken it too far. And that hand would just have Silent Hill Downpour and Silent Hill Homecoming. Everyone who's a Silent Hill fan either hates me for saying that or loves me for saying that, so let's move on. But When I'm talking about restraint here, I know that this is the most controversial and uncomfortable topic. So, yeah, I think we should move on. Let's talk about a different topic. One that relates a little more to agency. The topic I'm referring to is, of course, our last letter E. Now, I know what at least one of you is currently asking. Agency and engagement are kind of the same thing, aren't they? Well, actually, I would argue in this context, no. Whereas agency mainly relates to gameplay and how the player relates to the world of the game, when it comes to a design perspective, agency more so directly relates to gameplay than engagement does. Engagement is everything else. Your music, your world. And granted, I know some people are going to say, oh, so you're going to say all horror games need good graphics? Actually, no. Here's an example that immediately comes to mind for me. Fatum Butula. This game uses a PS1 aesthetic, and honestly, I don't really know how to explain it, but this game gives me Yume Nikki vibes. The music, the world, even the endings all feel very early to mid-90s PlayStation game. And I mean that in the best way possible. Granted, even if you're not going for things like an old aesthetic, things like music can go a long way. Take the Silent Hill franchise. The work by Akira Yamaoka on the soundtracks for Silent Hill, as I mentioned in my Silent Hill 2 recap, is very much part of the heart and soul of the franchise. Even when the franchise got film adaptations that used his music, that, if anything, should show just how important music is to a horror franchise. Heck, let's do a little case study here. Let's have a little, I guess, experiment with this concept. So, I'm going to record myself reading the opening segment from an Edgar Allan Poe story. With one of them, there's going to be no atmosphere, it's just going to be me reading it and a basic background. With the other one, I'm going to add music, I'm going to add a background video, and you tell me which one you think is more effective. From childhood's hour I have not been, as others were I have not seen. As others saw I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow I could not awaken, my heart to joy at the same tone, and all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life was drawn, from every depth of good and ill, the mystery which binds me still. From torrent, or the fountain, from the red cliff, or the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky, as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm, and when the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. Alright, and now let's play that recording back with some actual stuff going on in the background. From childhood's hour I have not been, as others were I have not seen. As others saw I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow I could not awaken, my heart to joy at the same tone, and all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life was drawn, from every depth of good and ill, the mystery which binds me still. from torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff or the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm, and when the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why did you use an Edgar Allan Poe's poem as an example for this? You see, on the surface it's a weird pick. But the reason I picked it is Edgar Allan Poe's poetry is A, short enough that I can put it into a video essay like this and people aren't going to say, "Hey SharpZ, you're wasting 30 minutes of my time reading an entire Stephen King novel." Actually, if I could read a Stephen King novel in 30 minutes, I could probably start a book speedrunning career. But that's aside the point. The main reason is because I wanted to show that even if you have the exact same assets, so let's say we were talking about a game like Silent Hill. If I were to take the mechanics of any of the Silent Hill games and attach them to another franchise, let's just say, for example, you know what, I'm going to go out to my shelf and just pick a game. I will be right back. And I'm going to record this in real time just to show that, actually, I don't know what I'm showing. Just give me, like, a minute. Yeah, that would be a good one to play. Yeah, I just picked out 3 games randomly. So, let's say that we were to make a Silent Hill game, mechanically, and put South Park over it. It would cease to be a horror game. Granted, I'm not saying that Matt Stone and Trey Parker couldn't handle horror. Honestly, I would kind of like to see that in a weird way. But it would cease to be as effective as it is. Or if you want, perhaps the best example... Wait, this is the wrong one. This game terrifies me. Never mind. This one also terrifies me, but I feel like it would be scary for completely different reasons. And for anyone who is aware of why I am picking this, yes, I am aware Slendy Tubbies exists. But let's say you were to take a child-friendly franchise and give it the same mechanics as Silent Hill. It wouldn't work. It might still have scary moments, but it wouldn't feel right. You see, horror is a genre that's not based on gameplay. It's a genre that's based on eliciting an emotion. And as such, anything that you can do to get the viewer to suspend their disbelief is important. This is part of why the Silent Hill games, at least 1 and 2, has CG cutscenes that are honestly astonishing for the platforms they were on. I'm not going to really show any because, honestly, go play the games. I know I've said it like 15 times, and I know at least 1 or 2 people are going to get mad at me because I mentioned Silent Hill about 10 times in this. But you know what? There is a reason why I mention Silent Hill constantly, and that's because I love it. Maybe I should talk to my psychiatrist about that. Anyway, the main reason I am going through all of this trouble just to talk about music and graphics is because, well, it is perhaps more important to horror than any other genre. You see, games like Doki Doki Literature Club, which are arguably simple, still have to graphically and musically immerse you into the visual novel world. Games like FNAF, which I know I have dogged on a lot, still go through a lot of effort sometimes to make you feel like you're actually looking through security cameras. Heck, one piece of advice that I commonly give people is if you're going to make a horror game, try to avoid stock sound effects. And before someone points out that my own game does that, yes, I am aware. I designed that around 2 or 3 years ago when I was first making it. And I'm working on that in the most recent updates, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, music, video, anything you can use to get that suspension of disbelief is important. And that is the core of engagement. You see, engagement requires another E word, and no, I'm not going to make this scare E with 2 E's. It requires effort. I mentioned the CG videos of Silent Hill, and I know that at least for Silent Hill 1, and I think to some extent for Silent Hill 2, you can see that for the CG videos, they put a lot of effort forward. If you look into the development of Silent Hill 1, the guy who made these HD videos, and I say the guy because it was just one person on staff, made them overnight, and, well, pretty much spent the entire night at the office just to render these videos. Because, well, computers were not that powerful back then, so if you wanted to render a video, you would need a lot of computing power, and that would take up everyone else's laptops, and you don't want to be the one guy in the office taking up everyone else's computer. Or, I mean, sticking to Silent Hill, look at things like the character designs, or the monster designs, or, heck, look at the fog. Like, for the PS1, this game looks amazing. And I'm not saying you need to make your game the prettiest or most graphically beautiful. No, games like Fatum Batula, Doki Doki Literature Club, Five Nights at Freddy's, and even to some extent games like Limbo are all games that don't have the most advanced graphical aesthetic. They are not cutting edge per se. But you know what they do have? They have an art style that is consistent. They know what they are trying to achieve, and they go for it, and they use everything they can, whether it be visual filters, music, assets, to just achieve that goal. Now, with my 7-minute rant of a madman done, I think it's time to wrap this all up. So without further ado, let's hand this over to me. Let's just say 2 days later. It wasn't actually 2 days later. I had to re-record the section the footage corrupted. Anyway, take it away, younger, slightly uglier me. Well, that seems like it's almost everything. Now then, since that skeleton guy from earlier seems like he's gone, I have changed my shirts 3 times, and my hair has magically gotten shorter. All within the span of about 1 video. I feel like it's about time I end this. Wait a second. This is an old recorder. The heck is this thing doing here? It says this one was recorded 2 hours ago. What? Wait a minute, when could this have even gotten here? I was sitting here for the last few days. Wait a second. The power. When the power went out, this must have been slipped on my desk. Oh, there's only one way to find out why it's here.
I bet you have many questions. How do I know who you are? How do I know where you live? And how did I enter and leave this? Well, you probably already know the answer to one of these questions. As my associate told you earlier, your door was unlocked.
Thanks, Sherlock.
But you probably want more answers. But first, I require something of you. Your refusal will be painful for you. If you want more information, you're going to have to meet me at your special place. 10 p.m. tonight. Don't be late.
Ah, shoot. It's 9:45. I should probably get going. Special place. I think I know where he means by that. Should probably get going. And it's only like, what, a 10-minute drive? Ugh. I'll be fine. You know what? If something were to happen, I should probably try to get a record. Yeah, it's gotta be somewhere in here, right? Somewhere in this area, right? Wait, I think I hear someone. Might be on the other side of the car. What the? James Trent Brockman. You probably don't remember me, but I sure as heck remember you. Sharpheticus Xenothadius, right? Place what you'll need in the back of your trunk. It's in the shed. Check it. Now. What? You need to see my face. Does that answer your question? It's probably just made more for you. It's in the bag, kid. Take a look at it. I think you'll know what you need to do. Wait, he left his jacket here too. Let's see when he took it off. Situations get weirder. Make sure I have I need. Guess we have to take that final step now, huh? Alright. Let's get this over with. Might not be safe with whatever's in there. Probably would best to leave the lantern here. I still have that light that I brought with me. I don't know what's awaiting me in here. Frankly, I don't know if I want to know. It's odd. This pretty much seems to be some kind of garden shed. Wait a second. That's the scariest thing I've seen all night. Well, let me just get that out of the... Well, now someone's just playing a cruel joke on me. What's the... So that's why. Guess I have to do it, huh? Usually I say that I'm gonna make a video and it doesn't happen. But I guess this time I had to do it. Grab everything. Is there something out there? It's odd. I think I see. Oh God. It stopped working. I need to grab these and get out of here. This isn't how it's supposed to happen. Ugh. Hopefully I don't regret this. You see, the thing with jump scares is that unlike something like a well-crafted, well-put-together horror setting, jump scares are kind of the horror equivalent of, well... no. Just go back to Fortnite. I'm just trying to offend everyone in this video, haven't I? Well, time to make even more people. Now, with all the spoiler warnings and everything else out of the way, let's get into my favorite part, the analysis. I think I already said that line. Darn. Alright, now that all of